She was signing divorce papers the morning I walked back into her life, and the pen dropped from her fingers when she saw me standing in the doorway like a ghost she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I watched her face move through every emotion she'd ever tried to hide from me, shock, then fury, then something softer and more dangerous than both, and I knew, the way you know a storm is coming before a single cloud appears, that whatever I'd told myself about moving on was the most beautiful lie I'd ever believed. The lawyer cleared his throat. Camille picked up the pen. And I stood there understanding that if I didn't say something in the next 10 seconds, I was going to spend the rest of my life watching the only woman I ever truly loved sign herself away from a life that should have included me. So I said the only thing I could think of. I said her name. My name is Nico Varen, and I have made exactly 2 decisions in my life that I am completely certain about. The first was starting my architectural firm from a one-room office with a second-hand desk and more stubbornness than talent. The second was falling in love with Camille Ashford on a Tuesday night in October, during a rainstorm so violent it flooded the ground floor of the building I was redesigning, stranding both of us inside with nothing but bad coffee and 3 years of things we hadn't said yet. That night started as a disaster. I'd been hired to renovate the Ashford Gallery, a crumbling but breathtaking old building in the heart of Portland that Camille had inherited from her grandmother and was slowly bringing back to life. She arrived at 8 in the evening to drop off some paperwork, and the storm arrived 10 minutes after her, fast and merciless, turning the streets outside into shallow rivers and the gallery's lobby into an island. The power flickered twice and gave up entirely. I found 2 emergency candles in a supply closet and a coffee maker that ran on stubbornness alone, and that was how we ended up sitting on opposite sides of a drafting table at 10 o'clock at night, 2 strangers waiting for a storm to pass, talking in the way people only talk when the world goes quiet enough to hear each other. She was guarded at first, the way someone is when they've learned that openness costs more than they can afford. She answered questions in careful sentences, edited before they left her mouth. But somewhere around midnight, something shifted. She told me about her grandmother, who had built the gallery from nothing and loved it the way most people love people. She told me about the years she spent traveling after college, alone, convincing herself she didn't need anyone. She laughed at something I said about a catastrophically failed design project, and the sound of it filled that dark, candlelit room like light fills a space after a long winter. By 1 in the morning, I was entirely lost. I should probably try to get home, I said, without making any move toward the door. She looked at the window, where rain was still hammering the glass in sheets. Then she looked at me with those gray eyes that saw more than she ever let on, and she said it softly, almost like she was testing whether the words were real. "Can you even get home in this?" "Probably not," I admitted, and then, because the moment felt absurd enough to be honest in, I said it as a joke, easy and self-deprecating, the kind of thing you say when you need to fill a silence that's gotten too heavy. "Can I just stay tonight?" The smile that crossed her face lasted only a second. Then she looked at the candle between us, and when she looked back up, something had changed in her expression, something unguarded and terrifying and real. "Only if you stay with me," she whispered. I told myself she meant it practically. I told myself it was the storm, the candles, the strange suspended quality of a night that had been cut loose from ordinary time. But the way she said it, quietly, like a confession she hadn't planned to make, told me she meant something larger than a place to sleep, something she might not have been able to say in daylight. I stayed. We talked until nearly 4 in the morning, and somewhere in the hours between midnight and dawn, the careful distance she kept between herself and the world collapsed just enough to let me in. I learned that she was 3 months out of a relationship she described only as a mistake I should have seen coming. I learned that she ran the gallery alone because trusting people with something you loved felt too dangerous. I learned that she was funnier than she let most people see and sharper than she wanted most people to know, and that she had a habit of looking at her hands when she was about to say something true. When morning came and the storm had finally exhausted itself, I stood at the gallery door with the strange feeling of someone waking from a dream they don't want to end. She stood a few feet away with her arms crossed and her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "Same time tomorrow?" I finally asked. "I have measurements to take." "Architectural ones," I added, and watched her fight a smile. "Tomorrow," she agreed, and the word felt like a door opening. Over the following weeks, tomorrow became a routine. I found reasons to be at the gallery every day, and she found reasons not to ask me to leave earlier. We shared takeout containers on the floor of half-finished rooms and argued about what the building wanted to become, and I noticed that the more time she spent with me, the more the guarded version of her retreated and the real one, the one who laughed easily and thought deeply and looked at the world with a curiosity that made me want to show her all of it, stepped forward. I should have known it was already too late. The afternoon she caught me looking at her across the gallery's second-floor landing, the afternoon light turning her hair to copper, and instead of looking away, I held her gaze long enough that there was no innocent explanation for it. "You're staring," she said. "I know," I said, because lying would have been embarrassing by that point. She didn't tell me to stop. I was so consumed by what was growing between us that I missed the signs that should have warned me. The phone calls she stepped outside to take. The slight flinch when someone knocked unexpectedly. The way she sometimes looked at me like she was memorizing my face, like she was storing something she was afraid she'd need to survive the loss of later. I didn't know yet about the man who had her phone number and apparently her loyalty. I didn't know about the secret she was carrying that had nothing to do with her ex-relationship and everything to do with why she flinched at unexpected knocks. I didn't know that the love growing in that gallery was already being watched by someone who had no intention of letting it survive. All I knew was that a woman had whispered 4 words to me during a rainstorm, and I had built my entire future on them without reading the fine print underneath. 6 weeks after the storm, I stopped pretending the gallery renovation was the reason I showed up every day. Camille stopped pretending she didn't know that. We existed in this unspoken agreement where neither of us named what was happening, because naming it felt like picking up something fragile with shaking hands, possible but terrifying. Then one evening I brought dinner, and she opened the door in a paint-stained shirt with a smear of cobalt blue across her collarbone, and something about the ordinary ease of her, the complete absence of performance, cracked me open in a way I hadn't braced for. "You have paint on your—" I started. "I know," she said, already turning to walk inside. "Are you coming in or are you going to stand there cataloging my mess?" I came in. I stayed 4 hours longer than I planned. And somewhere around 10 o'clock, sitting beside her on the gallery's restored wooden floor with a half-empty container of Thai food between us, she leaned her head against my shoulder like she'd been doing it for years, and I stopped breathing for a full 3 seconds. "Nico," she said, her voice low. "Yeah. I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is. I don't let people in easily." "I know," I said. "I've been climbing the wall for 6 weeks." She laughed, soft and real, and then she tipped her head up to look at me, close enough that the gallery seemed to shrink to just the 2 of us. "You didn't give up," she said, like it surprised her. "I won't," I said, and meant it in a way I'd never meant a promise to anyone before. She kissed me first, tentative and then not tentative at all, and I understood in that moment that I was no longer capable of being reasonable about this woman. Whatever damage she did to my carefully constructed emotional distance, I was going to let her do it because the alternative, walking away, was something I could no longer manufacture the will for. But love this fast always carries a shadow. I started noticing his name 2 weeks in. Rowan Hale. He called the gallery number. He texted her from a number she kept on silent but always checked. She never mentioned him, and I never asked directly, but I watched the way her body changed when his name appeared on her screen. A subtle tightening, something between dread and obligation that didn't look like love but didn't look entirely like fear either. I brought him up once, carefully. She said he was someone from her past who was having a hard time accepting the word over. She said it with such even calm that I believed her more than I should have, because I wanted to. Then he appeared. I arrived at the gallery one afternoon to find a man leaning against the front desk with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of being the most charming person in any room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and a smile that arrived before the rest of his face and lingered after it. He extended his hand before Camille could say a word, and the smile he gave me was the smile of a man who had already decided I wasn't a serious obstacle. "Rowan Hale," he said. "Old friend of Camille's." The word friend landed wrong, The way a note slightly off-key lands wrong in a song you know by heart. Nico Varen, I said. Architect. Ah, he said, looking around the gallery with a slow, practiced appreciation. You're doing beautiful work here. Camille always had extraordinary taste in the people she let in. Something about the way he said it, let in, like I was a temporary choice rather than a permanent one, made the back of my neck tighten. Camille stepped between us with practiced smoothness, redirecting the conversation, but I caught the look she gave him when she thought I wasn't watching. It wasn't the look of a woman facing an annoying ex. It was the look of a woman managing a situation that had the potential to become dangerous. He came back 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, always with a plausible reason, always with that same rehearsed ease. He brought her coffee once, the specific order she'd mentioned to him once years ago that he'd apparently filed away like a useful piece of intelligence. He touched her arm when he laughed, light and brief, the way you touch someone when you want to remind them of your presence without looking like you're trying. I started arriving earlier and staying later. I wasn't proud of it. I recognized the jealousy for what it was, a possessive, irrational thing, but watching Rowan Hale collect small moments with Camille was the kind of thing that made rationality feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. One night I told her I didn't trust him. She went very still. You don't know him. I know how he looks at you, I said. He's complicated, she said carefully. Our history is complicated. But he's not a threat, Nico. Then why do you look like you're holding your breath every time he walks in? She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. 2 nights later, I found them in the gallery after hours, a conversation I clearly wasn't supposed to witness, her arms wrapped around herself and him leaning close, voice low, and her face not the face of a woman talking to an old friend. It was the face of a woman being asked for something she didn't want to give. I left before she saw me. I drove home with my hands too tight on the wheel and the specific misery of a man watching something he loves slip toward an edge he can't reach. She called me twice before midnight. I answered the second time. It's not what you think, she said, and her voice was shaking. Tell me what it is, then, I said. Tell me everything, Camille. Right now. Because I have been all the way in with you since a rainstorm 3 months ago, and I need to know if I'm standing in something real or something you've been managing from a distance this whole time. The silence lasted long enough to rearrange everything. I can't, she finally said. Not tonight. I'm sorry. She hung up, and in the space that her voice had just occupied, I felt the first real crack in something I'd believed was unbreakable, and understood that the secret she'd been carrying since before I ever walked into that gallery was about to arrive between us like a storm far worse than the one that started it all. The story ran on a Wednesday morning, and I found out the same way everyone else did. A headline on my phone screen while I was still in bed, the words rearranging my understanding of the last 3 months faster than I could catch up with them. Ashford Gallery Director named in financial fraud investigation. Rowan Hale cooperating with federal authorities. I read it 3 times. Then I read the details, each one landing like something heavy dropped from a height. The investigation centered on the gallery's foundation accounts, funds meant for community arts programs that had allegedly been redirected over a period of 2 years. Rowan Hale, described as a former business partner and financial advisor to the gallery, had provided testimony implicating the gallery's director in the scheme. The director, the article noted, had recently retained legal counsel. Camille's name was in the 4th paragraph. I called her before I'd finished reading. She picked up on the first ring, which told me she'd been awake, waiting, probably watching her phone and dreading exactly this moment. Tell me it isn't true, I said, and hated myself for needing to ask. It isn't true, she said immediately, her voice steady in the way voices are steady when they've been prepared for a particular conversation. Nico, I need you to listen to me. Why didn't you tell me? I said. Why didn't you tell me any of this? The calls. Rowan. The reason you looked like you were managing a bomb every time he walked in? Because I was trying to protect you from being associated with it, she said, and then her voice broke for the first time. Because the moment you knew, you'd be part of it, and I couldn't do that to you. You're firm. Don't, I said. Don't make decisions about what I can handle. That's what people do when they don't actually trust you. The silence between us was different from any silence we'd shared in the gallery. Those silences had been warm, full of things we were building toward. This one was cold and full of what we were losing. I need to be honest about what I did next, because it's the part I'm least proud of. I pulled back. Not completely, not in words, but in the small ways that matter most. Shorter calls, missed dinners, excuses that were technically true but fundamentally a way of creating distance while I tried to work out what I believed. Rowan, predictably, stepped into the space I left. He was photographed with her outside her lawyer's office 3 days after the story broke. He was described in follow-up articles as a concerned former colleague supporting her through a difficult time, which was so precisely calibrated a lie that it had to have been planned. He had given the authorities just enough of the truth to keep himself clean and enough distortion to point the blame at Camille, and then positioned himself as her ally so she'd have nowhere else to turn. I didn't understand any of that yet. What I understood, sitting in my office staring at a photograph of them on a news website, was the specific devastation of watching someone you love stand next to the person who might be destroying them while you've chosen distance over standing beside her. Her lawyer called me 2 weeks into the investigation. Not Camille. Her lawyer, a careful woman named Prentice, who explained, in the tone of someone delivering news that would hurt, that Camille had submitted a formal statement to the authorities, and part of that statement involved the gallery's renovation contracts. My contracts? Rowan had apparently suggested to investigators that the financial irregularities might have involved payments to contractors as a concealment method, and my name had been included in a list of parties to be questioned. I went completely still in my chair. She didn't name you, Prentice said carefully, but the investigation will likely reach you regardless. I thought you deserved to know before they made contact. I called Camille then, and this time she didn't pick up. I drove to the gallery, and the lights were off for the first time since the renovation began. I drove to her apartment and stood outside it in the cold, and then I did something I had never done before in any relationship. I nearly walked away without fighting. I sat in my car outside her building for an hour, telling myself she'd hidden everything from me, that I didn't know who she actually was, that the woman I'd fallen in love with in a candlelit gallery during a rainstorm had maybe never been real. I was so deep in my own pain that I almost missed the thing that should have been obvious from the beginning. Rowan had too much to gain. He'd been her financial advisor. He had access to the exact accounts now under investigation. He had arrived back in her life precisely as the investigation began, positioned himself as her supporter, maneuvered me out of her orbit, and was now somehow both the witness against her and the shoulder she was leaning on. I got out of the car. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew with enough experience in financial fraud cases to tell me if what I was looking at was possible. Is it possible for someone to engineer a fraud investigation against a person while simultaneously acting as their key witness and emotional support? I asked my friend who'd spent a decade as a forensic accountant. It's not just possible, she said. It's a documented playbook. Who are we talking about? I told her everything. And the thing that started as a hunch hardened into certainty in the space of a 40-minute phone call. Rowan Hale hadn't just implicated Camille. He had set her up with enough precision to make the implication look inevitable, and he'd timed his return to her life to make sure she had nowhere to look for help except directly at him. The secret Camille had been carrying, the real one, wasn't that she'd committed fraud. It was that she'd discovered the fraud herself months earlier, traced it back to Rowan, and had been trying to quietly gather evidence against him without triggering the investigation before she was ready. She hadn't told me because the moment I knew, I became a liability to her case. She had been protecting me while I had been pulling away from her, and the understanding of that arrived in my chest like something finally breaking open after months of pressure. I went back to her apartment at 7 in the morning, and this time when I knocked, I didn't stop until she answered. She opened the door looking like someone who hadn't slept in days, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes carrying the specific exhaustion of a person who has been fighting alone for too long. She looked at me standing in her doorway, and something in her face did what it had done the very first night. It moved through every emotion before settling on the one she was least able to hide. "You should stay away from me right now," she said. "Nico, I mean it. Being associated with this." "I know what Rowan did," I said. She went completely still. I know about the foundation accounts. I know he redirected the funds and built the paper trail to point at you. I know you found out months ago and started documenting it, and I know you've been doing all of that alone because you were trying to keep me out of the blast radius. I stepped closer. I know you were protecting me while I was busy pulling away from you, and I need you to know that is the single stupidest thing I have ever done in my entire life. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then her face did something complicated and entirely undone, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and the tears she'd been holding back apparently for weeks finally arrived. I was so close, she said, voice breaking. I had almost everything I needed to take to the authorities myself. And then he went first, and suddenly I was the suspect instead of the witness, and I couldn't. I know, I said. I've got something better than almost everything. I held up a drive my forensic accountant friend had helped me compile overnight, transaction records, communication logs, timestamps that put Rowan's access to the accounts at hours that directly contradicted his testimony. This is enough. My contact says this is more than enough. She stared at the drive, then at me, like she wasn't sure which one was more unbelievable. How did you? Because I love you, I said, simply and completely, and I should have said that months ago instead of getting scared and pulling back, and I am done making decisions based on what's safer to feel. I'm not leaving. I'm done with distance. And I'm going to stand next to you in every room this case takes us into until the truth is so obvious that no one can pretend otherwise. What came next wasn't cinematic. It was 3 weeks of attorneys and affidavits and financial forensics that made my head ache, of official interviews where I sat outside conference rooms waiting, of Camille coming home to my apartment because hers had started to feel like a place where bad news arrived, and of slow evenings where neither of us talked about the case, just existed in the quiet reassurance of someone else nearby. Rowan's attorney fought hard. The man was built for survival, all charm and misdirection, and even cornered he managed to look reasonable. But the timestamps didn't negotiate. The account access logs didn't perform. The email chain my forensic contact had reconstructed from a server Rowan believed had been wiped told a story in his own words, careful, meticulous, and entirely damning. The investigation closed on a Thursday morning, Camille cleared of all charges, Rowan Hale facing a federal indictment that his smile was going to have significant difficulty talking its way around. Her lawyer called her at 9 and I was sitting across from her at my kitchen table when she heard the news, and the sound she made, not a word, just a breath that had been held far too long finally let go, was the most relieved sound I have ever heard another person make. She looked at me across the table and her eyes were wet and wide and present in a way they hadn't been in weeks. It's over, she said. Not all of it, I said. She tilted her head. I asked you a question once, in a rainstorm, I said. As a joke. You gave me an answer that wasn't a joke, and I spent the next few months learning what you meant by it, and then I spent a few more weeks being a coward about it. I reached across the table and took her hand. I want to stay, Camille. Not just tonight. Not until the case closed or the gallery was finished or the next hard thing arrived. I want to stay through all of it. Every complicated, inconvenient, frightening piece of it. She turned her hand over and held mine properly, fingers interlaced, the way you hold something you're not planning to put down. I'm not easy, she said. I have terrible instincts about who to trust. You trusted me, I said. Eventually. I trusted you almost immediately, she admitted, and the honesty of it landed somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there. That's what terrified me. I wasn't ready to need someone that quickly. And now? She looked at me for a long moment, gray eyes steady and open in a way I hadn't seen since those early candlelit nights in the gallery when the world was just the two of us and the rain. Now I think being ready was always overrated, she said. Now I think the only thing that ever actually matters is whether the person is worth the risk. I stood up and walked around the table and pulled her up with me, and I held her the way you hold something you came extraordinarily close to losing, which is to say tightly, and with a gratitude that doesn't have a word large enough to contain it. Was I asked against her hair. Worth it? She laughed, that real, unedited laugh that had filled the dark gallery the first night and ruined me entirely. Ask me again in 40 years, she said. I'll have a better data set. 6 months later, we reopened the Ashford Gallery together. The renovation was complete, every room exactly what the building had been waiting to become, full of light and recovered wood and the particular warmth of a space that has been loved rather than just finished. Camille stood in the center of the main hall in a dress the color of the sea during a storm and looked around at everything we'd built, and then she looked at me with an expression I was only just beginning to feel like I deserved. Can I ask you something? She said. Always, I said. That night, during the rainstorm, when you asked if you could stay, she paused, mouth curving. Were you actually joking? I thought about it for exactly as long as honesty required. About half, I admitted. She reached up and touched my face with the same careful, certain gesture she'd used outside her door the morning the investigation ended, like she was confirming I was solid and permanent and real. Good, she said, because I wasn't joking at all when I answered. Some love stories begin with grand gestures, proposals in crowded places, declarations in front of witnesses, love letters written to be remembered. Ours began with a rainstorm and a joke and 4 whispered words that turned out to be the truest thing either of us had ever said to each other. And every day since, I have been grateful for bad weather, candlelight, and the very specific courage it takes to say stay before you're certain the other person will.